After 8 years of funding his lifestyle, my fiancé looked me in the eye at a Michelin-starred restaurant and told me I was not worthy of being his wife. He said he was leaving me for someone better. I did not cry or beg. I just laughed and handed the waiter my black card. A year later, his beautiful new girlfriend married a federal criminal and lost everything. Now he is blowing up my phone begging to come back. But the person reading those pathetic messages is my new husband, the billionaire who bought out his entire company. Upgrading my standards was the most ruthless revenge I could have ever planned. My name is Clara. I am 33 years old, and I work as a senior commercial real estate appraiser. I spend my days calculating risks, analyzing market trends, and exposing bad investments for high-profile clients. But for 8 long years, my biggest financial drain was my fiancé, Brandon. I think we should cancel the wedding. Brandon's voice was loud enough to make the older couple at the next table turn their heads in our direction. We were sitting at a prime corner table in Le Bernardin, one of the most exclusive dining rooms in Manhattan. He slid the cheap velvet ring box across the pristine white tablecloth. It dragged against the fabric and stopped right next to my sparkling water glass. Sitting next to him were his mother Patricia and his younger sister Amanda. Both of them were wearing matching, cruel smirks, clearly enjoying the ambush they had helped orchestrate on a Friday evening. "You are just not worthy of being my wife." Clara Brandon continued casually adjusting the cuffs of the expensive designer suit I had bought for his previous birthday. "I need a real woman, someone who elevates my status, someone with passion and high society appeal. You are just a calculator. You have no vision for our future." Patricia leaned forward, her heavy floral perfume practically suffocating me across the narrow table. "Brandon is right, dear," she said, reaching over to pat his hand with exaggerated sympathy. "You are just too boring for him. You work all the time. You do not even care about fashion or networking. Brandon is a regional sales manager now. He is climbing the corporate ladder. He needs a wife who looks the part, not someone who wears plain gray suits and stays home reading financial reports on the weekends." Amanda chimed in, swirling her expensive glass of wine with an air of unearned arrogance. "Honestly, Clara, you should be thanking him for not dragging this out until the altar. Savannah is just a better fit for our family. She actually knows how to live life to the fullest." Savannah, his 26-year-old public relations assistant, the girl who had been leaving overly friendly comments on his social media for the past 6 months. The girl I had calmly warned him about, only to be called paranoid, insecure, and controlling. They sat there, 3 members of a highly toxic family, waiting for me to break down. They expected tears. They expected me to beg him to reconsider, to promise I would change my personality, to offer to buy him a new luxury car, to make up for my supposed flaws. That was the exhausting dynamic we had operated on for years. Every time Brandon felt insecure about his own failures, he would put me down, and I would quietly open my wallet to fix the situation and keep the peace. But as I looked at his arrogant face, I felt absolutely nothing. No heartbreak, no devastation, no urge to fight for his affection. Just an overwhelming sense of relief. The heavy fog of obligation had suddenly lifted from my shoulders. I smiled. Then a soft chuckle escaped my lips. I actually laughed out loud in the quiet restaurant. Brandon frowned, his confident posture slipping for a fraction of a second. "What is so funny?" he demanded, his face flushing with sudden anger. I did not answer him. Instead, I raised my hand and signaled for our waiter. When the young man hurried over to our table, I reached into my leather purse and bypassed the joint debit card Brandon always used for his daily expenses. I pulled out my sleek, heavy black American Express Centurion card. A card Brandon had no idea existed. "Please put my meal and my glass of wine on this," I told the waiter with a polite smile. "These 3 will be taking care of their own bill tonight." Brandon stared at the black metal card as the waiter quickly walked away. "You are making a massive mistake, Clara," he scoffed, trying desperately to regain the upper hand. You are going to regret this when you realize no one else will ever put up with your cold personality. I picked up my purse and stood up from the table, smoothing the front of my gray suit with calm precision. You are completely free, Brandon. I wish you and Savannah the best of luck. I looked down at him, my voice dropping to a calm, icy tone that commanded attention. Just make sure you and all your boxes are out of my penthouse by 10 o'clock tomorrow morning. Brandon rolled his eyes and let out a harsh, mocking laugh that echoed in the quiet space. Your penthouse, he mocked loudly. Are you delusional? We rent that place together. My name is on the lease just as much as yours. You cannot legally kick me out. I leaned in just slightly, keeping my voice perfectly level and devoid of emotion. You really should read the legal documents you sign more carefully. You pay the monthly electric bill. But I bought that apartment in cash 3 years ago. You are just a temporary guest, and your welcome has officially expired. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit the like button and subscribe if you have ever had to cut a toxic partner out of your life and discovered your true worth. The morning sun poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows of my Manhattan penthouse, casting a warm golden glow over the imported marble floors. I sat at the kitchen island quietly sipping a cup of black coffee. I felt completely rested for the first time in years. Neatly stacked by the front door were exactly 5 cardboard boxes. They contained everything Brandon actually owned in this massive apartment. His golf clubs, his cheap designer knockoff cologne, and his endless collection of overpriced protein powders. Everything else, the custom velvet furniture, the high-end electronics, the expensive artwork, belonged exclusively to me. At exactly 9:30, the front door clicked open. Brandon strode into the foyer, puffing his chest out like a conqueror, claiming his hard-earned territory. Trailing closely behind him was Savannah. She was wearing a tight pink dress and carrying a designer handbag that I recognized immediately, mostly because I had paid the credit card bill for it just 2 months ago. Savannah looked around the sprawling living room, her eyes widening at the panoramic view of the city skyline. Wow, babe, this place is absolutely gorgeous. Savannah practically squealed, running her hand along the back of my custom sofa. We should definitely redecorate the living room, though. It is a little too dark and depressing for my taste. I want lighter colors, maybe a massive white rug right here. Brandon smirked and wrapped an arm around her waist. Whatever you want, baby. This is our fresh start. He then turned his attention to me, his smug smile hardening into a vicious glare. I told you to be out of my apartment by 10 o'clock, Clara. Why are you still sitting there drinking coffee in your robe? Grab your things and leave. I took another slow sip of my coffee, savoring the rich taste, before carefully placing the mug down on the marble counter. The boxes by the door are yours, Brandon. I suggest you take them and leave before I call building security to escort you both out. Brandon let out a harsh, mocking laugh. He walked closer to the kitchen island, slamming his hand down on the marble to try and intimidate me. You are not calling anyone. I am the one who holds the lease. I have been paying the monthly bills for this place for the entire time we have lived here. You have no legal right to kick me out of my own home. In fact, if you do not pack your bags and walk out that door right now, I am calling the police and having you officially removed for trespassing. Savannah crossed her arms and glared at me with a look of pure entitlement. You really should just leave, Clara. It is honestly embarrassing that you are trying to squat in a successful man's apartment after he already dumped you. Have some dignity and go. I did not raise my voice. I did not show an ounce of anger or frustration. I simply opened the top drawer of the kitchen island and pulled out a thick, heavy manila envelope. I reached inside, pulled out a crisp, notarized legal document, and slid it across the smooth counter directly toward Brandon. You have never paid rent here, Brandon, I said, my voice dangerously calm. Not for the last 3 years. Brandon scoffed and picked up the paper, his eyes scanning the dense legal text. What is this garbage? Some kind of fake lease you typed up this morning to scare me. I rested my elbows on the counter and looked him dead in the eye. That is the official property deed. Notice the name printed clearly under the ownership line. It says Clara. Just Clara. There is no Brandon on that document. 3 years ago, when you thought our landlord was selling the building, I bought this entire penthouse for $1.5 million in cash. I let you continue paying the monthly electric and water bills so your fragile ego would feel like you were the man of the house providing for us. You paid $200 a month for utilities. I own the multi-million-dollar real estate. You do not hold a lease because there is no lease. The color drained from Brandon's face instantly. His confident posture crumbled as his eyes darted back and forth across the page, desperately searching for a loophole that did not exist. The thick paper trembled slightly in his hands. "This is illegal," he stammered, his voice suddenly pitching higher in panic. "We were engaged. Half of this property belongs to me. I contributed to this household." "We were never married," I corrected him smoothly. "And you never contributed a single dime to the actual purchase price. Legally speaking, you are just a house guest who has officially overstayed his welcome." The silence in the room was deafening. But the most satisfying reaction did not come from Brandon. It came from Savannah. The smug, victorious smile completely vanished from her face. She dropped her arms to her sides and stared at Brandon, her eyes narrowing with sudden sharp suspicion. "Wait a minute," Savannah said, her voice sharp and demanding. "You do not own this place. You told me you bought this penthouse last year. You told me you were making mid-six figures and owned a ton of real estate." Brandon swallowed hard, turning to her with a panicked look. "Baby, I can explain. She is trying to trick us with legal loopholes. Do not listen to her." I stood up from my stool and walked over to the front door, opening it wide to reveal the empty hallway. Savannah took another step back from him, her gold digger radar clearly going off as she realized the man she thought was her wealthy ticket to luxury was actually completely broke. "The clock is ticking, Brandon," I said, pointing toward the hallway. 5 boxes. That is your entire net worth right there. Grab them and walk out." The heavy oak door clicked shut behind them, sealing my penthouse off from their entitlement. I locked the deadbolt and took a deep cleansing breath. The silence in my apartment was beautiful, a stark contrast to the chaotic energy Brandon always dragged into the room. But that peaceful silence only lasted for about 10 minutes. My cell phone resting on the kitchen island began to vibrate violently. It was not just one or two text messages. It was a continuous stream of rapid notifications buzzing against the stone counter. I picked it up and unlocked the screen. My display was completely flooded with alerts from Facebook, Instagram, and a dozen furious text messages from phone numbers I instantly recognized as Brandon's extended family. I opened Facebook first. Amanda had wasted absolutely no time playing the victim card on her brother's behalf. She had posted a highly dramatic status update and tagged half the city, including our mutual acquaintances. The post read, "I am so incredibly proud of my big brother for finally breaking free from his toxic gold-digging ex-fiancé. For years, she manipulated him, drained his energy, isolated him from us, and tried to control his hard-earned success. Today, he finally chose his own true happiness and left her for a woman who actually knows how to love him. Good riddance to bad trash." Below her vicious post were dozens of comments from their relatives praising Brandon for his bravery. Then came the direct messages. His aunt sent a text calling me a cold-hearted leech. Patricia sent a massive paragraph demanding I immediately return the precious family heirloom engagement ring. That text actually made me laugh out loud, considering the ring Brandon gave me was a cheap cubic zirconia he bought on clearance from a mall kiosk. Most people would be absolutely devastated by a public smear campaign of this magnitude. They would rush to the comment section to desperately defend themselves. I did neither. Arguing with fools only proves there are two fools in the room. I put my phone on silent, walked straight into my minimalist home office, and sat down at my desk. It was time to systematically sever the financial umbilical cord that had kept Brandon afloat for 8 long years. I opened my laptop and logged into our primary banking portal. We had a joint checking account, which Brandon loved to show off because it always carried a massive balance. What he conveniently forgot to mention was that my corporate real estate salary was the only money actually funding it. With 3 precise clicks, I transferred the entire balance of $92,000 into my private individual account. The joint balance updated immediately to read exactly $0. Next, I tackled the credit lines. I was the primary account holder on the Platinum travel card he used constantly to pay for his expensive business lunches and apparently his dates with Savannah. I navigated to the Authorized Users section, located his name, and clicked Remove. His purchasing power was instantly revoked. I did the exact same thing for the high-yield emergency savings account he always treated like a personal piggy bank. By the time I closed my laptop 30 minutes later, Brandon's net worth had officially plummeted to match his actual reality. Just as I was stepping away from my desk, my phone lit up with a new text message. The name flashing brightly on the screen made me pause in surprise. It was Jamal. Jamal was Amanda's husband. He was a highly successful veterinary surgeon, an intelligent, grounded African-American man who always seemed entirely too good for their chaotic family. We had always shared a quiet mutual understanding at the exhausting family dinners, exchanging knowing glances whenever Patricia started one of her delusional rants. Jamal saw right through Brandon's fake corporate persona. I opened the message. It read, "I just saw Amanda's ridiculous post. It is absolutely disgusting, and I told her to take it down immediately, but she refuses to listen. I am so deeply sorry you have to deal with this circus today. Listen to me, Clara. I know exactly how these people operate. They are going to try and spin this narrative to make you look like the villain. But they forgot one crucial detail. I still have full access to the old cloud storage drive from when I helped Brandon set up his home office computer last year. I have all the backup files, the banking statements, and the digital receipts showing you personally paying off his $80,000 credit card debt. Let me know when you want to drop the bomb. I have your back." I stared at the glowing screen, a genuine dangerous smile spreading slowly across my face. Brandon thought he had successfully burned my reputation to the ground. He had absolutely no idea that his own brother-in-law was holding the match that was about to incinerate his entire fake life. I typed a quick reply to Jamal. "Keep those files safe. The fireworks are just getting started." I set my phone down and leaned back in my chair, imagining the exact moment Brandon would realize the full extent of his new reality. I did not have to wait long. Less than an hour later, my phone began to ring. It was not a text this time. It was an incoming call from Brandon. I let it ring 3 times before calmly swiping the screen to answer. "Are you out of your mind?" Brandon screamed through the speaker so loudly that I had to hold the phone away from my ear. "You thief! You absolute psycho! Put my money back right now." I smiled, picking up a pen and casually twirling it between my fingers. "I am going to need you to lower your voice, Brandon, and you will need to be much more specific." "Do not play games with me, Clara," he raged. "I am standing at the checkout counter at the Prada boutique in Soho. My platinum card just declined. My debit card just declined. The cashier is looking at me like I am a criminal. I checked the banking app and the joint account is at 0. You stole $92,000 from me. Transfer it back this second or I'm calling the cops." I could hear the frantic embarrassment in his voice. I could also hear the faint ambient music of the luxury store in the background, which meant he was causing a public scene. He had clearly taken Savannah on a celebratory new beginning shopping spree to prove his wealth after the humiliation at my apartment. First of all, I replied smoothly, "You cannot steal what already belongs to you. Every single penny in that joint checking account came directly from my corporate salary. I simply moved my own earnings into a private account. Second, I removed you as an authorized user on my Platinum travel card. You are no longer entitled to my credit limit." He let out a sound of pure panic and fury. "That was our money, Clara. We were building a life together. You cannot just cut me off with no warning. Savannah is standing right here watching this happen. Oh, Savannah is there with you. I asked, my voice dripping with polite curiosity. Put me on speakerphone, Brandon. I think your new girlfriend deserves to hear the truth about her wealthy provider. I am not putting you on speakerphone, he hissed, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. You do not have to. A sharp female voice echoed through the line. It was Savannah. She must have snatched the phone directly out of his hand. Clara, what exactly is going on here? Why are all of his accounts empty? Hello, Savannah, I said cheerfully. I hope you are enjoying your shopping trip. To answer your question, his accounts are not empty. My accounts are simply no longer accessible to him. For the past 8 years, I have been the sole financial provider in our household. Brandon makes a modest salary as a regional sales manager, most of which goes toward his personal debts and his expensive car payments. The money he used to take you to exclusive dinners, the money he used to buy you that designer handbag last month, and the money he was trying to use today, all of it came from my paycheck. There was a heavy, suffocating silence on the other end of the line. I could perfectly picture the look of sheer horror spreading across Savannah's perfectly contoured face as the illusion of her rich boyfriend shattered into a million pieces. You told me you were a millionaire, Savannah said, her voice trembling with rising anger. You told me you were the one funding her lifestyle. You said she was just a boring accountant who dragged you down. Baby, please listen to me. I heard Brandon pleading in the background. She is manipulating the system. She is just doing this to punish us because she is jealous. I can fix this. Just give me a day to call my bank and sort this out. I am not doing anything to punish you, Brandon, I interjected calmly. I am simply matching your energy. You said I was not worthy of being your wife. You said you needed a real woman to elevate your status. I am just stepping aside so you can fully step into your role as a high society provider. Good luck paying for those shoes with your own money. I tapped the red button and ended the call, tossing my phone back onto the desk. On the other side of the city, standing in the middle of a high-end boutique with several sales associates staring at them, Brandon stared blankly at his useless plastic cards. Savannah shoved the phone back into his chest, her eyes blazing with absolute disgust. Do not even try to speak to me right now, Savannah told him coldly, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. I am not about to be humiliated in public because you lied about your bank account. You have exactly 24 hours to fix whatever mess this is. Figure it out right now, or I am leaving you right here at the mall. Brandon sat alone in his car in the mall parking lot, his hands gripping the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white. He watched Savannah storm out of the shopping center and jump into the back of a black car, leaving him completely humiliated. He had exactly 24 hours to produce an impossible amount of cash to maintain the fake lifestyle he had promised her. Panic set in. He had no savings, no credit, and no backup plan. So he drove straight to the one person who had spent her entire life shielding him from the consequences of his own actions: his mother. Patricia was sitting in her heavily decorated living room when Brandon burst through the front door. He looked like a defeated child. He immediately launched into a wild, fabricated story of ultimate victimhood. He told Patricia that I had completely lost my mind out of pure, bitter jealousy. He claimed I had illegally locked him out of our shared bank account, stolen his hard-earned savings, and kicked him out of the apartment he had helped pay for over the last 8 years. Patricia did not question a single word. She never did when it came to her golden child. She immediately pulled him into a comforting hug, stroking his back as if he had just scraped his knee on the playground. That wicked girl is trying to financially abuse you, Patricia cooed, her voice trembling with misplaced, righteous anger. She knows you are moving on to a better life with Savannah, and she is trying to trap you. Do not worry, sweetheart. I will write you a check to cover your immediate expenses, and I am going to have a little chat with Clara to make sure she gives you your fair share of that penthouse. The next afternoon, I was walking through the expansive marble lobby of my corporate headquarters. I had just finished a highly successful risk assessment meeting for a major commercial client and was heading toward the Courtyard Cafe for a late lunch. I was wearing a tailored navy blue suit, feeling completely in control of my environment. Suddenly, a shrill, piercing voice echoed across the quiet, polished space, slicing through the low hum of professional conversations. "Clara, stop right there!" I turned around to see Patricia marching aggressively past the reception desk. Her face was flushed dark red with anger, and she was pointing a perfectly manicured finger directly at my chest. Several of my colleagues and passing executives stopped in their tracks, turning to stare at the sudden commotion. Patricia stormed up to me, practically vibrating with rage. She smelled of cheap hairspray and desperation. "How dare you!" she hissed loudly, ensuring everyone within a 50-foot radius could hear her. "How dare you steal my son's money and throw him out on the street like a stray dog? You are a bitter, jealous woman. Just because he realized he deserves a beautiful, vibrant woman instead of a cold machine does not give you the right to hold his finances hostage." I stood perfectly still, letting her exhaust her initial burst of energy. My expression did not change. I did not flinch, and I did not look embarrassed. Patricia hated my silence. It always made her feel small, and right now she was desperately trying to feel big. "You are going to transfer his money back today," Patricia demanded, her voice echoing off the glass walls. "And you are going to sell that apartment and give him exactly half of the equity. He invested 8 years of his life into you. He deserves a massive payout for tolerating your miserable personality." I slowly looked around the lobby, making brief eye contact with the head security guard, who was already walking briskly toward us. Then I looked back at Patricia, my face completely blank. "Patricia," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, but carrying a heavy authoritative weight that forced her to stop yelling. "You are currently standing in a high-security commercial building screaming at a senior director. I am not going to argue with you about your delusional son. Brandon did not invest a single dollar into my apartment or my bank accounts. He is broke because he has always been broke. The only difference is that I am no longer funding his illusion." "You are a liar," Patricia shrieked, taking an aggressive step forward. "You stole from him. He told me everything." The security guards arrived, placing their large frames firmly between us. "Ma'am, you need to leave the premises immediately," the head guard said, gesturing toward the revolving glass doors. Patricia ignored him, glaring at me with pure hatred. "You will be hearing from our lawyers, Clara. We are going to take everything you have." I took one step back, preparing to walk away. But before I turned my back on her, I decided to give her a small piece of reality to take home to her precious son. "Tell your lawyers to look closely at the credit card statements," I said smoothly. "But before you write him that rescue check, you should probably ask him where his money actually went. Did your perfect son tell you that he maxed out my travel card buying a $15,000 diamond necklace for Savannah last month?" Patricia froze. The angry color instantly drained from her face, leaving her looking pale and suddenly very old. I tilted my head, offering a sweet, artificial smile. "That is right, Patricia. He was buying luxury jewelry for his new girlfriend while he was still sleeping in my bed, eating the food I bought, and living under a roof I paid for. So if you want to know where his money went, I suggest you go look around Savannah's neck." Patricia stood there, completely stunned into silence, her mouth opening and closing without any sound coming out. I gave a polite nod to the security guards and walked toward the cafe, leaving her standing in the lobby as her golden boy's perfect image began to violently crack. 2 weeks passed since my brief but highly satisfying encounter with Patricia in the corporate lobby. The financial reality of his situation must have been suffocating Brandon, but a narcissist will always choose the illusion of grandeur over the humility of starting over. I knew he was desperate to prove to Savannah that he was still a high roller, which explained exactly why he showed up at the annual Manhattan Heritage Real Estate Charity Auction. The auction was an exclusive invite-only gala held in the grand ballroom of the Plaza Hotel. It was a room filled with genuine generational wealth and quiet luxury. I was not there to socialize. I was attending as the lead commercial appraiser for the event, ensuring that the luxury properties being auctioned were accurately valued. I wore a custom-tailored emerald green silk gown. It had no flashy logos, no excessive glitter, just impeccable craftsmanship that spoke for itself. I was standing near a display of architectural blueprints sipping a glass of sparkling water when I heard that familiar obnoxious laugh. I turned my head and saw Brandon strutting into the ballroom with Savannah clinging to his arm. They had likely bribed a junior staff member or bought a cheap general admission ticket just to get through the door. Brandon was wearing his favorite shiny gray suit, and Savannah was wearing a plunging red dress. Resting perfectly against her collarbone was the $15,000 diamond necklace Brandon had purchased using my credit card. Brandon spotted me almost immediately. Instead of avoiding his ex-fiancé like a normal person, his bruised ego saw an opportunity. He wanted to humiliate me in a room full of rich people to elevate his own status in front of Savannah. He marched straight over to my section, speaking loudly enough to turn the heads of several wealthy investors nearby. "Well, look who it is," Brandon sneered, looking me up and down with exaggerated disgust. "Still wearing boring plain clothes, I see. You look like a corporate librarian who accidentally wandered into a high society gala. I told you, Clara, you simply do not know how to fit in with the upper class." Savannah let out a high-pitched giggle, reaching up to touch her stolen diamond necklace. "Honestly, babe, it is kind of sad," she chimed in. "Some people just do not have the sophisticated taste for events like this." I did not flinch. I did not insult his shiny suit or point out that Savannah was wearing evidence of his credit card fraud. I just looked at them with a mixture of boredom and mild pity. Before I could even open my mouth to reply, a deep, calm voice resonated from right behind me. "I highly doubt a woman appraising $50 million properties needs fashion advice from a man wearing a polyester blend." Brandon froze. Savannah stopped giggling. I stepped slightly to the side as Harrison walked up to join me. Harrison was 36 years old and the managing partner at one of the most ruthless venture capital firms in New York. He was also one of my most important VIP clients. He stood at 6'2", wearing a bespoke midnight blue tuxedo that probably cost more than Brandon made in an entire year. Harrison possessed a quiet, commanding authority that instantly sucked the air out of Brandon's inflated chest. "Excuse me," Brandon puffed up, trying to sound intimidating but failing miserably. "Who do you think you are? I am a regional sales director and an investor. I belong here." Harrison did not raise his voice. He simply looked at Brandon the way a scientist looks at an interesting insect. "You are a tourist," Harrison stated clinically, his eyes scanning Brandon with razor-sharp precision. "Your suit lapels are glued, not stitched, which means it is an off-the-rack piece from a discount department store. And if you are going to pretend to be an investor, you should know that the second hand on a genuine Rolex sweeps smoothly. Yours is ticking. It is a terrible fake. You are embarrassing yourself in a room full of people who actually own the buildings you work in." Several people standing nearby chuckled softly. Brandon's face turned a violent shade of purple. He instinctively pulled his arm back, trying to hide the fake watch under his jacket sleeve. Savannah stepped away from him, her face burning with secondhand embarrassment as people began whispering. Harrison dismissed Brandon completely, shifting his body to block Brandon from my view. He turned to me, his tone shifting from cold dissection to absolute unwavering respect. "Clara." "I am sorry for the interruption," Harrison said, ignoring Brandon's existence entirely. "My board of directors is waiting on your final word. We need your brilliant mind to sign off on the Hudson Yard commercial acquisition. It is a $50 million deal, and I told them we will not move a single cent until you personally guarantee the appraisal. Do you have a moment to review the final numbers with me?" I smiled up at Harrison, feeling the undeniable shift in power. "Of course, Harrison. Let us head to the VIP lounge." I walked away with Harrison, leaving Brandon standing in the middle of the ballroom, completely exposed as a broke fraud, wearing a ticking watch, while the woman he called a boring calculator went off to finalize a $50 million empire. The fallout from the charity auction was immediate and brutal. As soon as Brandon and Savannah stepped out of the Plaza Hotel and into the crisp night air, Savannah exploded. She did not even wait until they were inside a taxi. She spun around on the sidewalk, her face twisted in absolute fury, and practically screamed at him. "I have never been so humiliated in my entire life," Savannah yelled, her voice echoing down the street. "A ticking watch, Brandon. Are you out of your mind? You brought me to a room full of actual billionaires wearing a fake Rolex and a cheap suit. I had women looking at me like I was a cheap escort." Brandon reached out desperately, trying to grab her hands to calm her down. "Baby, please lower your voice. That guy was just an arrogant jerk. Clara probably paid him to come over and insult me because she is jealous that I moved on with someone as beautiful as you." Savannah snatched her hands away from him, her eyes completely devoid of affection. She looked at him with the cold, calculating glare of a woman who was realizing her investment was entirely worthless. "I do not care about Clara," Savannah hissed. "I care about the fact that you lied to me. You told me you were a high-level investor. You told me you had millions tied up in real estate. But ever since you kicked your ex out, your cards have been declining and you are wearing fake jewelry. I am done playing these games." "Wait," Brandon pleaded, his voice cracking with sheer panic. "I can prove it to you. My money is just tied up in a messy legal transition right now. I am wealthy, Savannah. I promise you." Savannah crossed her arms, tapping her designer heel against the pavement. "Fine. Prove it. I want a car, a brand new Porsche Cayenne, black on black with the premium interior. If you are the millionaire you claim to be, you will go to the dealership tomorrow and buy it for me. If you do not have those keys in your hand by Friday, lose my number permanently." She turned on her heel, hailed a passing cab, and left him standing alone on the sidewalk. Brandon was officially out of options. He had no savings. His credit score was entirely dependent on the accounts I had recently severed. He knew that if he walked into a luxury car dealership and let them run a legitimate background check, he would be laughed out of the showroom. But the fear of losing Savannah, the ultimate trophy that proved his superiority over me, drove him to do something incredibly reckless. That night, sitting at the small desk in his mother's basement, Brandon booted up his laptop. He downloaded a digital document editor and pulled up his most recent pay stubs and tax forms. With a few frantic clicks, he began to alter his reality. He erased his actual modest salary of $65,000 and replaced it with a highly inflated gross income of $350,000. He fabricated bonuses, forged a fake investment portfolio statement, and printed the entire stack of lies on thick, high-quality paper to make it look official. The next morning, Brandon walked into the largest luxury auto dealership in the financial district. He wore his best suit and walked with the exaggerated swagger of a man who owned the world. He picked out the exact Porsche Cayenne Savannah demanded, fully loaded with a sticker price of over $110,000. When the finance manager asked for his proof of income, Brandon confidently slid the forged documents across the desk. The dealership manager was thrilled to make a massive sale, but because Brandon was asking for a zero down payment loan on a six-figure vehicle, the application could not be approved in-house. It had to be sent out to their primary commercial lending partner for a high-risk manual underwrite. What Brandon did not know was that the lending partner the dealership used was the exact same commercial bank I had been consulting for. Earlier that week, following the massive success of the $50 million appraisal I completed for Harrison, the bank's executive board had officially brought me on as an external consulting director for their risk management division. I was given a corner office, a lucrative retainer, and full access to audit their most complex and suspicious financial applications. On Thursday morning, I was sitting at my new mahogany desk, sipping a cup of herbal tea while reviewing a stack of flagged high-risk auto loans. The underwriting department had sent them over because the numbers looked artificially inflated. I opened the third manila folder in the stack. My eyes scanned the top line of the application. The applicant name was Brandon. I set my tea down very slowly. I flipped to the second page, staring at the attached W-2 forms and bank statements. I knew exactly what Brandon earned down to the very last cent. The documents staring back at me claimed he was making over $300,000 a year. A slow, dangerous smile spread across my face. Brandon had not just lied to his girlfriend. By submitting these forged documents to a federally insured bank, my foolish ex-fiancé had just committed felony loan fraud, and his entire fate was sitting right on my desk. I sat in my quiet corner office, staring at the fraudulent tax forms and inflated bank statements Brandon had foolishly submitted. It was almost poetic. For 8 years, he had used my actual money to fund his life, and the very first time he tried to fund it himself, he resorted to committing a federal crime. I did not feel an ounce of pity. I reached across my mahogany desk and picked up my heavy official self-inking stamp. I positioned it perfectly over the signature line of his application and pressed down firmly. The bold red letters reading "Declined" due to fraudulent documentation bled through the paper. But I did not stop there. As a senior risk director, I had a strict legal obligation to report financial crimes. I attached a formal memo detailing the exact discrepancies between his claimed income and his actual financial history, and I forwarded the entire file to the bank's internal fraud investigation unit. Brandon was not just getting denied for a car. He was getting blacklisted from ever receiving a legitimate loan from this institution again. Across town at the luxury auto dealership, Brandon was completely unaware of the absolute disaster heading his way. He strolled through the glass double doors of the showroom, with Savannah holding tightly onto his arm. He had dressed in his best suit again, wearing a smug smile as he guided her toward the sleek black Porsche Cayenne sitting on the showroom floor. Savannah was practically vibrating with excitement, already snapping pictures of the leather interior for her social media followers. Brandon approached the finance manager's glass office, expecting to be handed the keys and treated like a wealthy VIP. Instead, the manager stepped out of his office with a deeply serious expression. He did not offer his hand for a handshake. He did not offer them a seat. He simply stood in the doorway holding a printed copy of Brandon's application. The manager looked at Brandon with a mixture of disgust and professional coldness. "I need you to step away from the vehicle and leave this dealership immediately," the manager said, his voice loud enough for the other sales associates to hear. Brandon froze, his arrogant smile faltering. "Excuse me, I am here to pick up my car. We processed the paperwork yesterday. We processed your forged documents yesterday," the manager corrected him sharply. "Our commercial lending partner just kicked your application back with a hard fraud alert. You altered your tax forms and falsified your income statements. That is a federal offense. We have already flagged your profile in our dealer network, and if you do not walk out those doors right now, I am calling the police to report you for attempted financial fraud." The silence in the showroom was absolute. Every single customer and employee was staring directly at them. Savannah dropped her phone, the color completely draining from her face as the reality of the situation crashed down on her. She slowly turned to look at Brandon, who was stammering desperately, trying to string together a coherent lie. "Baby, there must be some kind of clerical error," Brandon pleaded, reaching out to touch her arm. "Let us just go outside and I will call my bank." "Do not touch me!" Savannah screamed at the top of her lungs, smacking his hand away. "You are a broke, pathetic liar. You do not have $1 million. You do not have any real estate. You cannot even afford to buy a car without committing a crime. I have wasted months of my life pretending to care about a man who wears fake watches and forges bank statements." She did not lower her voice or care about the audience watching them. She unclasped the designer handbag he had bought her using my credit card and threw it directly at his chest. Then she turned around and stormed out of the dealership, leaving Brandon standing alone in the middle of the showroom, completely exposed as a fraud to the entire world. Back in my office, the chaos of Brandon's life felt 1,000,000 miles away. I was reviewing a legitimate commercial portfolio when my private office line rang. I picked it up expecting a junior analyst. Instead, the deep resonant voice of Harrison filled the line. Clara Harrison said smoothly. I just finished reviewing your final risk assessment for the Hudson Yard acquisition. Your attention to detail is unmatched. The board is thrilled, and we are moving forward with the $50 million purchase tomorrow. I smiled, leaning back in my leather chair. I am glad I could provide clarity for the board, Harrison. It was a complex portfolio, but the numbers never lie. Exactly, Harrison replied. Because you delivered such exceptional work, I would like to formally invite you to dinner this Friday. Not a working dinner, a private reservation at Fiancé. I want to celebrate your brilliant mind and thank you properly for protecting my investments. I agreed without hesitation. Hanging up the phone, I looked out the large glass window at the sweeping view of the city. Brandon was out there somewhere drowning in a shallow pool of his own lies. Meanwhile, I was being invited to one of the most exclusive restaurants in the world by a billionaire who actually respected my intelligence. The contrast was beautiful. While I was selecting the perfect outfit for my upcoming Friday night dinner with Harrison, the walls were rapidly closing in on Brandon. The fallout from his humiliating experience at the luxury car dealership had finally caught up with him. Without Savannah to impress, without his fake corporate persona holding any weight, and with the very real threat of federal fraud charges hovering over his head, he ran straight back to the only safety net he had ever known. He went back to his mother. But reality has a funny way of catching up with everyone, and even Patricia had her financial limits. Sitting at her ornate dining room table, Patricia was forced to stare at a massive stack of Brandon's actual financial statements. Without my steady corporate income masking his reckless spending habits, the raw numbers were absolutely terrifying. He owed over $80,000 in high-interest credit card debt. He had multiple personal loans he had taken out to buy Savannah expensive gifts, and he was facing mounting legal fees from his desperate attempts to cover his tracks. Patricia calculated her modest retirement savings and realized she could not even put a small dent in the massive financial crater her golden child had dug for himself. So she did what she always did. She tried to make his problems someone else's responsibility. Patricia summoned her daughter Amanda and her son-in-law Jamal for a mandatory emergency family dinner on Tuesday evening. Jamal had always hated these toxic gatherings, but he attended solely to keep the peace for his wife. The atmosphere in the dining room was suffocating. The roast chicken on the table was getting cold. Brandon sat slumped in his chair, looking like a punished toddler, completely refusing to make eye contact with anyone in the room. Patricia did not waste time serving the food. She stood at the head of the table, clasping her hands together in a dramatic display of fake distress. Family is the most important thing we have in this world, Patricia began, her voice trembling with calculated manipulation. Your brother has been deeply victimized by a cruel, vindictive woman who completely destroyed his credit out of pure spite. He is in a very tight spot right now, and he needs our help to rebuild his life. Since my fixed income is simply not enough to cover this temporary setback, I need you two to step up and do your part. Amanda, I need you and Jamal to take out a second mortgage on your house to consolidate Brandon's debts. Jamal stopped eating. He slowly placed his silver fork down on his porcelain plate. But before he could even process the absolute audacity of his mother-in-law, Amanda leaned forward eagerly. Her entire life had been spent desperately trying to win just a fraction of the approval Patricia freely handed to Brandon. Yes, Mom, Amanda said without a second of hesitation. Of course we will help him. We have plenty of equity in our house. We can go to the bank tomorrow morning and start the paperwork. Brandon is family. We cannot just leave him struggling on his own. The heavy mahogany table shook violently. Jamal slammed his fist down onto the wood with such sudden explosive force that the silverware clattered loudly against the china plates. The entire room instantly fell into a dead, terrified silence. Patricia gasped, clutching her chest in shock, while Brandon practically jumped out of his chair. You are not taking out a second mortgage on my house to fund a parasite, Jamal stated. His voice was not loud, but it possessed a deep, dangerous authority that demanded absolute silence. His dark eyes locked directly onto Amanda, completely ignoring the other two people in the room. Amanda blinked rapidly, looking genuinely shocked by his sudden defiance. "Jamal, please," she whispered frantically, reaching for his hand. "He is my brother. We have to help him. It is just a temporary loan until he gets back on his feet. He is never getting back on his feet." "Amanda." Jamal fired back, his tone laced with absolute disgust as he pulled his hand away. "Because he never stood on his own 2 feet to begin with. Do not sit there and let your mother lie to you about some temporary setback caused by Clara. I know exactly what is going on in this house. I know exactly how much your precious brother owes." Jamal turned his sharp, unyielding gaze toward Patricia, stripping away her victim narrative piece by piece. He owes $80,000 in credit card debt. He owes $20,000 in personal loans. He has absolutely zero savings because he spent the past 8 years using Clara as a human bank account. And I know for a fact that the only reason he needs this massive financial bailout today is because he just got caught trying to commit federal loan fraud at a luxury car dealership to impress a gold digger who dumped him in the parking lot. Brandon turned ghost white. Patricia opened her mouth to scream at him to defend her precious son, but Jamal raised a hand, silencing her instantly. He stood up from the table, his towering frame casting a shadow over the room. He turned back to his wife, delivering the final crushing blow. "You have a very serious choice to make right now," Amanda Jamal said coldly. "If you walk into a bank tomorrow and sign a single piece of paper to mortgage our home for his pathetic mistakes, do not bother coming back to our house, because the very next piece of paper you sign will be divorce documents." The threat of divorce hung in the air like thick smoke. For 3 long seconds, absolutely no one moved. Then the fragile illusion of Brandon's superiority violently shattered. Brandon shoved his chair back so hard it tipped over and crashed loudly against the hardwood floor. Driven by sheer panic and a desperate need to protect his fragile ego, he lunged across the dining room. He reached out to grab Jamal by the collar, attempting to use physical intimidation to regain control of the room. "Do not ever speak to my sister like that!" Brandon screamed, his face contorted in a mask of furious desperation. "I am the man of this house, and I will not let you disrespect my family." But Jamal was a large, powerfully built man who wrestled agitated mastiffs and Great Danes onto operating tables for a living. He did not even flinch. As Brandon closed the distance, Jamal simply reached out and caught his wrist mid-air, stopping his momentum entirely. Jamal gripped the arm tight enough to make Brandon gasp in pain, then effortlessly shoved him backward. Brandon stumbled awkwardly, his expensive leather shoes slipping on the Persian rug before he caught his balance against the wall. Jamal let out a deep, booming laugh that completely stripped Brandon of whatever fake masculinity he had left. "Are you really trying to fight me right now, Brandon?" Jamal asked, shaking his head in pure amusement. "You cannot even afford to pay for a gym membership without Clara swiping her credit card to cover your monthly dues. Sit down and shut up before you actually hurt yourself." "How dare you put your hands on him?" Patricia finally shrieked, snapping out of her shocked paralysis. "You come into my home, eat my food, and threaten my family. You are a liar, Jamal. Clara brainwashed you just like she tried to brainwash my son." Jamal did not argue with her. He calmly reached into the inner breast pocket of his tailored jacket and pulled out a thick stack of neatly folded papers. He stepped forward and dropped them directly onto Patricia's lap. The heavy thud of the documents hitting her floral dress silenced her instantly. "I am not a liar," Jamal stated, his voice ringing with absolute, unshakable certainty. "And unlike you, Patricia, I actually look at the facts before I open my mouth. Those are the official bank records. The ones you never bothered to ask for because you were too busy worshiping your son. Read them. Look at the highlighted sections." Patricia stared down at the papers, her hands shaking slightly as she picked up the first page. "That is the $80,000 credit card debt he racked up 2 years ago," Jamal explained, pointing at the bold numbers. "And right below it is the wire transfer from the personal corporate account belonging to Clara, completely wiping it out so he would not have to declare bankruptcy." "Turn the page, Patricia," She slowly turned the page, her eyes scanning the lines of data. Amanda stood up and peered over her mother's shoulder, her eyes widening in horror as she saw the sheer volume of the transactions. Those are the utility bills, the luxury car insurance payments, and the expensive vacations you all took to Mexico, Jamal continued relentlessly. Every single one of them paid in full by Clara. Your son is not a victim of financial abuse. He is the perpetrator. He is a financial parasite who finally drained his host completely dry, and now he is trying to attach himself to my wife, to drain us next. Brandon was backed against the wall, breathing heavily, completely unable to form a coherent sentence. He looked at his sister, pleading with his eyes. Mandy, please do not listen to him. He is manipulating those papers. Clara faked them to ruin my life. But Amanda was not looking at Brandon. She was staring at the undeniable proof of her brother's parasitic lifestyle. The brother she had constantly compared herself to, the golden child who could do no wrong in their mother's eyes, was nothing but a complete fraud. Jamal buttoned his jacket and adjusted his cuffs. He looked at the three of them with a mixture of pity and absolute disgust, then turned his attention entirely to his wife. I have spent years watching this family tear down a woman who literally kept a roof over your brother's head, Jamal said, his tone softening only slightly for Amanda. I watched you all cheer when he treated Clara like garbage. I will not let you drag our marriage into this toxic sinkhole to save a man who refuses to save himself. Jamal walked past Brandon without giving him a second glance. He stopped at the archway of the dining room and looked back. I am going home, Amanda. You have exactly 24 hours to make your decision. You can stay here and drown in debt with your mother and your brother, or you can come home and be my wife. But if you walk through my front door tomorrow, you leave this circus behind permanently. Jamal turned and walked out, the heavy slam of the front door echoing through the quiet house. Brandon stood frozen against the wall, completely exposed, his fake empire reduced to a stack of printed papers sitting uselessly on his mother's lap. News of the disastrous family dinner spread quickly. Jamal kept his word. Amanda packed her bags the very next morning, apologizing to her husband and leaving Brandon completely isolated in his mother's cramped basement. With his family safety net completely destroyed, Brandon clung desperately to the only thing he thought still validated his worth as a man. Savannah. He needed her to prove that leaving me was a step up, an upgrade that justified all of his terrible decisions. But Savannah was a master of survival in the ruthless ecosystem of Manhattan wealth. The moment Brandon failed to produce the keys to that black Porsche Cayenne, his value plummeted to absolute zero. She began executing the slow fade. It started with ignored text messages, then she began declining his phone calls, sending them straight to voicemail. She claimed she was suddenly overwhelmed with major projects at her public relations firm and needed space to focus on her career. But Brandon knew exactly what she was really doing. He spent every waking hour sitting in the dark, obsessing over her digital footprint. He watched in agonizing real time as she posted perfectly curated videos from the velvet booths of exclusive hotel lounges. She was sipping $300 champagne, wearing dresses that left very little to the imagination, and tagging locations specifically known for attracting wealthy investors. She was actively networking for a new financial sponsor, and she was not trying to hide it. Driven completely mad by panic and rejection, Brandon decided to ambush her. On a Thursday evening, he drove his outdated sedan to her apartment building in the financial district and parked illegally by the curb. He sat there for 3 agonizing hours, sweating in his cheap suit, waiting for her to come out. When Savannah finally strolled through the revolving glass doors of the lobby, she was wearing a stunning black cocktail dress and heavily applied makeup. Brandon jumped out of his car and marched right up to her on the sidewalk. He demanded to know where she was going. He accused her of ignoring him and looking for another man behind his back. Savannah did not apologize. She did not even look slightly guilty. She simply stopped walking, crossed her arms over her chest, and looked at him with a mixture of pity and absolute contempt. She flipped the psychological script on him entirely. Are you seriously stalking my apartment building right now, Brandon? Savannah asked, her voice dripping with pure condescension. You are acting completely unhinged. I am not ignoring you. I am just busy living my own life while you are busy trying to suffocate me. Brandon reached out to grab her hand, but she immediately snatched it away. Baby, I am just worried about us, he pleaded, his voice cracking with desperation. You have been so distant ever since the dealership. I told you I am fixing my portfolio. I just need a little more time to get my liquid assets in order. Savannah rolled her eyes, letting out a harsh, mocking laugh that cut him straight to the bone. There is no portfolio, Brandon, she snapped coldly. You lied to me about your bank accounts, you embarrassed me in front of actual millionaires, and now you are standing on a public sidewalk acting like an insecure, controlling maniac. You are just not the high-value man I thought you were. A real man does not stalk his girlfriend. A real man provides. Now move out of my way before I call the doorman to have you removed. She pushed past him, hailed a passing taxi, and left him standing alone on the pavement. But Brandon could not let it go. His obsession with maintaining the illusion that he had won the breakup drove him to do something even more pathetic. That Saturday night, he tracked her location using a background app they had shared months ago. He parked his car across the street from a highly exclusive neon-lit nightclub in the meatpacking district. He sat there in the dark for hours drinking cold coffee, watching the VIP entrance with manic intensity. Around 2 in the morning, the heavy velvet ropes finally parted. Savannah walked out into the cool night air. But she was not alone, and she was not with her girlfriends. She was clinging tightly to the arm of a tall man wearing a flashy designer jacket, expensive sneakers, and a thick gold chain resting against his collar. The valet rushed forward and pulled up a matte black Lamborghini Aventador. The massive engine roared, echoing aggressively down the empty street. Brandon watched in pure paralyzed horror as the flashy man opened the passenger door for Savannah. She leaned in, kissed him passionately on the mouth, and slid gracefully into the low leather seat. Brandon scrambled for his phone, desperately checking the social media tags from the nightclub. It only took him 5 minutes of frantic searching to find the man's public profile. His name was Lance. He was a loud, arrogant cryptocurrency trader who constantly flaunted his massive wealth online. Brandon realized in that crushing moment that he had not just been replaced. He had been completely outplayed in the exact same shallow, materialistic game he had tried to play with me. While Brandon was freezing on a dirty sidewalk outside a loud nightclub, I was experiencing a completely different universe. Harrison had reserved a private room at an exclusive omakase restaurant, hidden behind an unmarked door in Tribeca. The room was a masterclass in quiet luxury. There was no pulsing bass, no flashing neon lights, and absolutely no need to shout over a crowd. It was just the two of us seated at a smooth cypress wood counter, watching a master chef prepare delicate pieces of fish that had been flown in from Tokyo that exact morning. The contrast between my past and my present was almost dizzying. Brandon used to complain about the price of the appetizers at chain restaurants, constantly demanding that I secretly hand him my credit card under the table so he could pretend to pay the bill. Harrison did not even look at a menu. The entire experience had been curated and paid for long before we even arrived. He poured me a glass of rare sake, his dark eyes studying my face with genuine interest. You have been quiet tonight, Clara Harrison observed, setting his porcelain cup down. You have the look of a woman who is calculating a very complex equation in her head. What are you thinking about? I smiled, tracing the rim of my cup. I was just thinking about the concept of sunk cost fallacy. I admitted, my voice low and steady in the quiet room. In real estate, when a property is structurally compromised, the smartest move is to tear it down and cut your losses. But in my personal life, I spent 8 years pouring my own foundation into a completely condemned building. I thought if I just paid enough bills, fixed enough of his mistakes, and carried enough of the weight, Brandon would eventually become the man he pretended to be. Harrison did not interrupt me. He did not offer empty platitudes or tell me I was foolish. He simply listened with the focused intensity of a man who actually valued my perspective. I think I was addicted to the project. I continued, finally voicing the harsh truth I had been avoiding. I grew up believing that a woman's value was tied to her ability to nurture and fix broken things. I thought I was building a partnership, but I was really just funding a very expensive charity case. It is embarrassing to admit that a financial appraiser misjudged an investment that poorly. Harrison reached across the polished wood counter. He did not grab my hand forcefully. He simply rested his hand over mine, offering a grounded, steady warmth. "You did not misjudge the investment," Clara Harrison said, his voice carrying that undeniable authority. "You simply misjudged the asset class. You are an empire builder. You know how to take raw materials and turn them into something spectacular. But Brandon is not a builder. He is a scavenger. Scavengers do not want to build an empire. They just want to consume the resources of the person who did the heavy lifting. You do not belong with scavengers. You belong at the top of the skyline with someone who brings their own steel to the construction site." The heavy knot of lingering guilt that I had been carrying in my chest completely dissolved. For the first time in almost a decade, I felt entirely seen by a man who did not want to extract anything from me. Harrison was not intimidated by my success. He demanded it. I took a deep breath, feeling a genuine, relaxed smile spread across my face. "Thank you, Harrison. That is exactly the kind of risk assessment I needed to hear." Speaking of risk assessments, Harrison shifted smoothly, his tone returning to the sharp, brilliant businessman I respected so much. "My venture capital firm is preparing to heavily short a new tech company on Monday. It is a massive cryptocurrency startup that has been aggressively recruiting retail investors. The numbers are a complete illusion. My analysts spent the last week tearing apart their blockchain ledgers." "Oh, really?" I asked, leaning in, my professional curiosity instantly ignited. "What is the structural flaw?" "It is a textbook Ponzi scheme dressed up in modern tech jargon," Harrison explained, taking a sip of his sake. "The founder is a flashy amateur who spends more time buying luxury cars and popping champagne at clubs than actually writing code. He is using new investor capital to pay off early adopters. The federal authorities are already sniffing around, and my firm is about to accelerate the collapse. A fraudulent founder using fake money to fund a flashy lifestyle." The concept sounded incredibly familiar. "What is the name of the company?" I asked. "It is called Apex Digital," Harrison replied, pulling his phone from his inner jacket pocket, "and the arrogant kid running it into the ground is named Lance." Harrison tapped the screen and slid the phone across the counter to show me the founder's profile. I looked down at the photograph and froze. Staring back at me was a picture of a man wearing a thick gold chain, leaning against a matte black Lamborghini. And standing right next to him, wearing a diamond necklace, paid for by my credit card, was Savannah. The trap was already set, and the people who tried to destroy me were about to walk right into it. The morning after I sat in that quiet, elegant omakase room, Brandon was experiencing the complete collapse of his manufactured reality. After watching Savannah speed off into the night in a matte black Lamborghini, he had not gone home to sleep. Instead, he drove straight to her luxury apartment building. He used the emergency spare key she had given him weeks ago, letting himself into her dark living room. He sat on her velvet sofa for 7 agonizing hours, his leg bouncing nervously, waiting for her to return. At 9 o'clock in the morning, the front door finally clicked open. Savannah walked in. She was carrying her expensive high heels in one hand, walking barefoot across the hardwood floor. She was still wearing the same tight black cocktail dress from the night before, and her makeup was slightly smeared. She stopped dead in her tracks when she saw Brandon sitting in the semi-darkness of her living room. "What are you doing in my apartment?" Savannah demanded, her voice sharp and entirely devoid of guilt. Brandon stood up, his face pale and his eyes red from lack of sleep. "I saw you," he yelled, his voice cracking with desperate anger. "I sat outside the club last night. I watched you get into a car with another man. After everything I have done for you, you are running around the city with some flashy crypto jerk." Savannah dropped her shoes onto the floor. She did not look ashamed. She looked deeply annoyed, as if she had just found a stray pest inside her home. "You sat outside a nightclub and spied on me," Savannah asked, her tone dripping with pure disgust. "You are completely pathetic, Brandon. Do you have any idea how unhinged you look right now? You are trespassing in my home to throw a tantrum because I went out with a man who actually has a functioning credit card." Brandon stepped forward, trying to grab her shoulders, but she shoved him away with surprising force. "Baby, please listen to me," he begged, his anger rapidly dissolving into sheer panic. "That guy is a joke. He is just flashing fake crypto wealth. I am a real corporate manager. We were supposed to be building a fresh start together. I left my fiancé for you." Savannah let out a cold, mocking laugh that echoed through the spacious apartment. "You did not leave anyone, Brandon. You got kicked out. And Lance is not a joke. He is the founder of a massive digital currency platform. He bought a table last night that cost more than your entire yearly salary. He does not forge bank documents to buy a car. He buys them in cash." She walked over to her kitchen counter, poured herself a glass of water, and turned back to face him. Her expression was completely empty. There was no sympathy, no lingering affection, and absolutely no respect. She looked at him exactly the way he had looked at me sitting at the table in Le Bernardin. "I think we should cancel whatever this relationship is," Savannah said calmly, taking a sip of her water. Brandon froze, his breath catching in his throat. "What are you talking about? You cannot do this to me, Savannah. I gave up my penthouse for you." "You gave up nothing," Savannah fired back smoothly. "You are a broke fraud who manipulated me into thinking you were a high-value provider. You are not worthy of me, Brandon. I need a real man who elevates my status, not a desperate salesman living in his mother's basement." The words struck him like a physical blow to the chest. It was the exact verbatim speech he had used to discard me, weaponized and fired right back at him by the woman he thought was his ultimate prize. He stood there completely paralyzed by the poetic brutality of her rejection. "Leave your spare key on the counter and get out of my apartment," Savannah ordered, pointing toward the door. "If you ever follow me or show up here again, I will have Lance's private security team deal with you. Now get out." Completely shattered, Brandon dropped the silver key onto the marble counter. He walked out of her building and stumbled to his outdated car, his fake empire reduced to absolute dust. He had lost the penthouse, his savings, his dignity, and now his trophy girlfriend. But he still thought he had one final sanctuary left. He drove back to the suburbs, desperate to crawl back into his mother's basement and let Patricia coddle him. He pulled into Patricia's driveway, exhausted and defeated. But as he walked up the concrete path, he noticed a massive bright neon notice taped aggressively to the front door. Patricia was sitting on the front porch steps, clutching a stack of legal documents, weeping uncontrollably. When Brandon rushed over to ask what was wrong, Patricia looked up at him with eyes full of terror and resentment. In a desperate attempt to cover his immediate legal fees and hold off the aggressive debt collectors Clara had unleashed, Patricia had taken out a massive predatory title loan against her house. She had defaulted on the incredibly high interest payments. The bank had officially finalized the foreclosure. Brandon stood on the manicured lawn, staring at the foreclosure notice fluttering in the wind. He was not just dumped, he was now officially homeless. Brandon woke up the next morning with a stiff neck and a blinding headache. He had spent the entire night sleeping in the driver's seat of his outdated sedan, parked in the very back corner of his company parking lot. With his mother's house foreclosed and padlocked by the bank and his access to my penthouse permanently revoked, his car was the only shelter he had left. He scrubbed his face with shaking hands, staring at his reflection in the rearview mirror. He looked like a ghost of the man who had confidently ordered an expensive dinner at Le Bernardin just a few months ago. His suit was deeply wrinkled, his eyes were bloodshot, and his arrogance had been entirely stripped away. He managed to sneak into the office building early, using the lobby restroom to splash cold water on his face. and desperately try to make himself look presentable. He needed to hold on to this job. It was the absolute last thread connecting him to the illusion of success. But a man drowning in personal chaos cannot maintain a professional facade forever. Brandon had not closed a single new deal in 3 weeks. He had been too busy stalking Savannah, screaming at his family and panicking over his massive debts to actually do his job as a regional sales manager. At 10 o'clock in the morning, the final blow landed. Brandon was sitting at his desk staring blankly at his computer screen when an urgent email popped into his inbox. It was from the supply chain director of his largest corporate account, the only massive client that was keeping his quarterly numbers barely afloat. The email was brief, cold, and entirely devastating. The client was immediately terminating their vendor contract with Brandon's division effective today. Before Brandon could even pick up the phone to frantically call the client and beg them to reconsider, his desk phone rang. It was the executive assistant for the regional vice president, Mr. Caldwell. The assistant told Brandon to report to the corner office immediately. Brandon walked down the carpeted hallway, his heart pounding against his ribs. He took a deep breath, pasting on the fake, charming salesman smile that had always gotten him out of trouble in the past. He walked into the spacious office and confidently took a seat across from Mr. Caldwell, acting as if everything was perfectly normal. "Good morning, sir," Brandon said smoothly, leaning back in his chair. "I saw the email from the tech account. I know it looks bad, but I am already putting a strategy together to win them back. These corporate transitions happen all the time." Mr. Caldwell did not smile. He did not lean back. He sat rigidly at his desk, staring at Brandon, with a mixture of exhaustion and utter disappointment. He had a thick file folder resting directly in front of him. "Do not insult my intelligence, Brandon," Mr. Caldwell said sharply. "You are not winning them back. In fact, you have not won anything for this company in a month. Your sales metrics have completely flatlined. You have been showing up late, taking extended lunches, and your team tells me you have been spending half your day aggressively arguing with people on your cell phone. What exactly is going on with you?" Brandon immediately shifted into his favorite role, the victim. He leaned forward, letting out a heavy, dramatic sigh, trying to look like a man carrying an unfair burden. "I apologize." Sir Brandon started, his voice dripping with manufactured sincerity. "I have been dealing with a highly toxic personal situation. My crazy ex-fiancé has been actively trying to ruin my life. She locked me out of my own bank accounts, she is harassing my family, and she has created an incredibly stressful environment. I have just been distracted trying to protect myself from her. But the worst of it is over. I am completely focused now, I promise you." Mr. Caldwell stared at him for a long, agonizing moment. Then he slowly shook his head, opening the file folder on his desk. "You are a phenomenal liar, Brandon," Mr. Caldwell stated coldly. "But you are a terrible businessman. That client did not leave because of a normal corporate transition. They left because they were just acquired in a massive buyout yesterday afternoon. The new parent company audited all of their vendor contracts this morning and immediately flagged yours for termination." Brandon swallowed hard. "A new parent company," he repeated nervously. "Who bought them?" "They were acquired by an elite venture capital firm," Mr. Caldwell explained, pulling a termination letter from the folder. "A firm owned by a man named Harrison. In fact, the termination order came down from his executive board directly. They stated that your professional reputation and your documented history of financial instability made you a massive liability to their new asset." Brandon felt all the air leave his lungs. The room started to spin. Harrison, the billionaire from the charity auction, the man who had smoothly humiliated him while treating me with absolute reverence. He was just now realizing that my new world was actively dismantling his entire existence. Mr. Caldwell slid the formal termination paper across the desk, handing Brandon a sleek black pen. "You brought your personal mess into my business, and it just cost me a multi-million-dollar account," Mr. Caldwell said, his voice dropping to a low, unforgiving tone. "Sign this paper. You are fired effective immediately. I want your desk cleared out and your company badge on my desk in exactly 15 minutes. Brandon stared blindly at the document. He could barely hold the pen as he scribbled his name. He stood up on shaking legs and walked out of the office. 15 minutes later, holding a small cardboard box of his belongings, he was escorted out the front doors by a security guard. He stood on the pavement under the harsh midday sun. He had no money, no home, no girlfriend, and now no job. The absolute destruction of Brandon was complete. While Brandon was packing up his desk under the watchful eye of a corporate security guard, the toxic ecosystem he had relied on for his entire life was actively collapsing in on itself. Jamal had given Amanda a very clear 24-hour ultimatum: choose her marriage or choose her parasitic brother. For a brief moment, it seemed like Amanda was actually going to make the right choice. She had packed an overnight bag and gone back to the beautiful home she shared with Jamal, promising him that she was done cleaning up Brandon's messes. But the lifetime of psychological conditioning installed by Patricia was simply too deep to break overnight. 2 days after the disastrous family dinner, Jamal logged into their joint banking application to pay their monthly mortgage. He noticed a massive pending withdrawal for $15,000. Amanda had secretly driven to a local bank branch while Jamal was at his veterinary clinic attempting to drain their emergency savings account to hand the cash directly over to Brandon to cover his mounting legal fees. She did not even try to deny it when Jamal confronted her that evening. She just cried, repeating the same tired lines Patricia always used about family loyalty and sticking together during hard times. Jamal did not yell. He did not argue. He calmly walked into their bedroom, packed 2 large suitcases, and left the house. He filed for legal separation the very next morning, securing a financial freeze on the remainder of their shared assets. Unable to process the reality of her own actions, Amanda desperately needed a scapegoat. She could not blame Brandon because that would mean admitting her mother was wrong. She could not blame Jamal because deep down she knew he was entirely justified. So she directed all of her misdirected rage at the easiest target, me. I was stepping out of the elevator into the sleek, sunlit lobby of my office building, holding a fresh cup of coffee when Amanda burst through the front doors. She looked completely unhinged. Her hair was messy, her clothes looked like they had been slept in, and her eyes were swollen and red from crying. She spotted me immediately and marched straight across the polished marble floor. "You ruined my life," Amanda screamed, not caring that several high-level executives were standing nearby, waiting for the elevators. "You ruined absolutely everything, Clara." I did not back away. I took a slow sip of my coffee and looked at her with mild, detached curiosity. "Amanda," I said calmly, "I highly suggest you lower your voice before I have security escort you out, just like they did with your mother." "What exactly are you talking about?" "Jamal left me," she sobbed, her voice echoing off the glass walls. "He packed his bags and moved out. And it is all your fault. If you had just been a supportive fiancé, if you had not maliciously cut Brandon off and frozen his accounts, he never would have needed my help. You are a selfish, evil woman. You destroyed my family just to punish my brother." I gestured toward a quiet alcove near the floor-to-ceiling windows, stepping away from the crowd. Amanda followed me, still wiping tears from her cheeks, waiting for me to apologize or defend myself. But I had no intention of doing either. "Listen to yourself, Amanda," I said, my voice low and completely devoid of sympathy. "You are standing in my office lobby blaming me because your husband finally realized he deserves better than a woman who steals from her own marriage." "I did not steal," Amanda fired back defensively. "Brandon is my brother. He needed cash to keep him out of jail because of the lies you told his lenders." "I did not tell any lies," I corrected her sharply. "I submitted his actual tax returns. Brandon committed fraud all by himself. He bought fake jewelry for another woman all by himself. And you chose to drain your joint savings account behind your husband's back all by yourself." "I have not spoken to Brandon or Jamal in weeks. I did not force you to walk into that bank, and I certainly did not force Jamal to pack his bags." Amanda opened her mouth to argue, but the words died in her throat. She looked at me, her chest heaving as the absolute, undeniable truth began to pierce through the thick wall of denial she had built around her family. You spent your entire life watching your mother sacrifice everything for Brandon? I continued relentlessly stripping away the last of her illusions. She expected you to do the same, and you did. You sacrificed your own husband for a man who would not even give you $1 if you were starving. I did not ruin your marriage, Amanda. You chose a parasite over a partner. The color completely drained from her face. Her shoulders slumped forward as the heavy, suffocating realization finally crashed down on her. All those years of being second best, of desperately trying to win Patricia's approval by enabling Brandon had culminated in this exact moment. She had traded a loyal, hard-working man who truly loved her for a brother who viewed her solely as an emergency bank account. Without another word, Amanda let out a broken sob. She covered her face with her shaking hands, turned around, and walked slowly out of the heavy glass doors into the bustling city street. She left completely alone, finally understanding that her mother and her brother were the ones who had truly destroyed her life. 6 months dragged by in a miserable blur. Following the aggressive foreclosure and complete loss of her sprawling suburban home, Patricia had begged a distant relative to let them rent a dingy, unfinished basement apartment in a rundown neighborhood on the outskirts of the city. The space was incredibly cramped. The ceiling leaked every time it rained, the outdated heater rattled constantly, and the air was thick with the permanent smell of damp mildew. This was Brandon's new reality. He spent his days completely ignoring the realities of his situation. He refused to apply for regular jobs, convinced that working a normal retail or entry-level corporate position was beneath his imagined status. Instead, he spent his nights sitting on a lumpy stained mattress, shoved into the dark corner of his room, drowning his humiliation in cheap liquor. His face was illuminated only by the harsh blue glow of his cracked smartphone screen as he obsessively scrolled through the digital lives of the people who had discarded him. Tonight, his self-inflicted digital torture reached an unbearable peak. Savannah had just posted a highly produced professional video montage to her Instagram account. She and Lance were standing on the expansive teak deck of a private yacht anchored off the glittering coast of Dubai. The video showed Lance dropping to one knee holding a velvet box containing a diamond ring so massive it looked almost ridiculous. Savannah was crying perfectly manicured tears of joy, kissing him aggressively, while a lavish fireworks display exploded in the night sky behind them. The caption below the video was a direct, brutal stab at everything Brandon lacked. It read, "Saying yes to my billionaire soulmate. Upgrading my life and leaving the broke boys behind was the best decision I ever made." Brandon threw his half-empty bottle of cheap beer across the room. It shattered violently against the cold concrete wall, sending glass and foam everywhere, but he did not care. The words "upgrading my life" echoed mockingly in his head. Savannah was living the exact luxurious lifestyle he had promised her, but she was doing it with a man who could actually afford the price of admission. His chest tightened with toxic jealousy and overwhelming inadequacy. He desperately needed to feel superior to someone. He needed to find someone whose life was worse than his. His twisted mind naturally wandered back to the woman he had abandoned. In his delusional, narcissistic reality, he convinced himself that I must be absolutely miserable without him. He imagined I was sitting all alone in my quiet penthouse, crying over our broken engagement, regretting the day I locked him out of my bank accounts. He opened his web browser and typed my name into the search bar, expecting to find a neglected social media profile, or perhaps a sad, lonely status update about heartbreak. Instead, the very first search result that appeared was a link to my private professional LinkedIn page. He clicked the link and his breath caught painfully in his throat. Staring back at him was my newly updated executive profile picture. I was not crying. I was not looking tired or defeated. I was wearing a stunning custom-tailored ivory blazer, standing confidently in front of a sprawling glass boardroom overlooking the Manhattan skyline. My title had been officially upgraded from senior appraiser to executive vice president of risk management at one of the top commercial real estate firms in the country. But it was the featured article pinned to the top of my professional page that completely destroyed his remaining sanity. The headline published by a major financial news outlet just 2 days prior read Clara secures historic $100 million commercial merger in downtown Manhattan. Brandon frantically clicked on the article, his eyes darting across the paragraphs. The financial journalists praised my brilliant negotiation skills and ruthless market strategy. The article detailed how I had single-handedly facilitated the massive corporate deal, saving the parent company millions in liability and earning a massive seven-figure executive commission in the process. Brandon stared at the glowing numbers on his cracked screen. $100 million, a seven-figure commission. While he was sleeping on a lumpy mattress in a moldy basement drinking cheap beer and watching his gold-digging ex-girlfriend marry a flashy criminal, the woman he had called a boring calculator was quietly building an absolute empire. I was not missing him. I was not grieving him. I had completely erased him from my trajectory and skyrocketed to a level of wealth and power he could not even fathom. A violent, suffocating wave of regret washed over him, crushing his chest like a physical weight. He had held a winning lottery ticket in his hands for 8 long years, and he had thrown it straight into the garbage because he wanted to play with loose change. He dropped his phone onto the concrete floor and buried his face in his hands, finally realizing the catastrophic magnitude of his own stupidity. While Brandon was suffocating under the crushing weight of his own failures, my life was moving forward with a quiet, unstoppable momentum. Over the past 6 months, Harrison and I had built a partnership rooted in absolute transparency, deep intellectual connection, and mutual respect. There were no manipulative games, no hidden credit card statements, and absolutely no need to perform our happiness for an audience. We operated as equals. One crisp evening in late November, Harrison invited me to his private residence. We were sitting in his expansive mahogany-paneled library enjoying a rare bottle of vintage wine while a fire crackled softly in the stone hearth. There were no hidden photographers, no extravagant floral arrangements, and no grand theatrical displays. That was not how Harrison operated, and he knew it was not what I wanted. Instead of abruptly dropping to one knee, Harrison reached over to his desk and picked up a thick, leather-bound folio. He walked back to the leather sofa, sat beside me, and placed the heavy folder directly into my lap. I opened the cover, expecting to see a new commercial real estate prospectus or a joint venture agreement. Instead, my eyes scanned the bold legal heading at the top of the crisp, watermarked paper. It was an irrevocable asset protection trust. I looked up at him, slightly confused but deeply intrigued. "What is this, Harrison?" I asked, my fingers tracing the legally binding text. "That is a bulletproof wall around everything you have built," Harrison stated, his voice calm and incredibly steady. "I know exactly how hard you worked to secure your financial independence, Clara. I know you spent years carrying the weight of a man who treated you like an endless resource. I want you to know with absolute legal certainty that I will never be a liability to your empire. This trust guarantees that your assets remain entirely yours, protected from any future vulnerabilities. I do not want your money. I want you." I stared at the document, profoundly moved by the gesture. For a woman who had been financially drained and manipulated by her past partner, a legally binding contract protecting my peace was the most romantic thing I had ever seen. Harrison then reached into his jacket pocket. He did not pull out a cheap velvet box. He simply opened his hand, revealing a ring that caught the firelight with blinding brilliance. It was a flawless, rare 5-carat emerald-cut diamond set on a simple, elegant platinum band. It was not gaudy or overly complicated. It was a masterclass in quiet, undeniable luxury. Clara, Harrison said, looking directly into my eyes, "Build the rest of your life with me. Be my wife." I did not cry hysterically or scream with exaggerated excitement. I felt a deep, overwhelming sense of peace settle over my entire body. I smiled a genuine and profound smile and told him yes. As he slid the perfect diamond onto my finger, we made a mutual agreement. We were not going to announce our engagement to the world. We were not going to post pictures of the ring on social media for the validation of strangers. Savannah and Brandon desperately needed the internet to believe they were successful in order to feel any self-worth. We did not. Our wealth, our power, and our union belonged entirely to us. We chose to keep our relationship completely private, building a fortress that absolutely no one from our past could access. 3 months later, that private fortress became official. We did not host a massive chaotic wedding in Manhattan. We flew to Italy and rented a historic secluded villa right on the edge of Lake Como. The ceremony was incredibly intimate, attended only by the local officiant and two of Harrison's closest business partners acting as our legal witnesses. I stood on a stone terrace overlooking the sparkling blue water, wearing a simple but breathtaking silk gown. The warm Italian sun washed over us as Harrison and I exchanged our vows. When the officiant handed me the heavy fountain pen, I signed my name on the marriage license with absolute certainty. I was officially stepping into a life of untouchable security and genuine partnership. At that exact same moment, thousands of miles away, in a damp, freezing suburb, Brandon was brutally, violently awakened from his sleep on the basement floor. A loud, grinding, mechanical noise echoed through the thin windows of his mother's rented apartment. Brandon scrambled out of bed, his heart pounding with sudden panic. He ran up the narrow stairs and pushed open the front door, stepping out into the freezing morning air, wearing only his sweatpants. Flashing yellow lights illuminated the broken concrete driveway. A heavy-duty tow truck was actively hoisting the front wheels of Brandon's outdated sedan off the ground. "Hey!" Brandon screamed, sprinting barefoot across the freezing pavement. "Stop! What are you doing? That is my car." The tow truck driver did not even flinch. He calmly stepped out of the cab holding a bright pink clipboard. He walked over to Brandon and shoved a printed legal notice directly into his chest. "Not anymore, buddy," the driver said coldly. "You are 4 months behind on your payments. The bank officially ordered the repossession. Step away from the vehicle before I call the local police." Brandon stood completely frozen on the icy driveway. He watched in absolute silent horror as the tow truck pulled away, dragging his very last valuable possession down the street and out of sight. While Brandon was standing barefoot on an icy driveway watching his last asset get towed away, his former trophy girlfriend was preparing to walk down the aisle. Savannah had spent the last 6 months meticulously planning a wedding designed specifically for massive social media consumption. She and Lance had rented out the grand ballroom of a historic New York estate. The venue was dripping in excessive gaudy luxury. There were massive walls composed entirely of imported white orchids, a towering 10-tier wedding cake covered in edible gold leaf, and a champagne fountain flowing with ridiculously expensive vintage champagne. Savannah truly believed she had won the ultimate prize. She was wearing a custom-designed $20,000 silk gown, covered in hand-sewn Swarovski crystals. As she walked down the aisle toward Lance, who was wearing a flashy velvet tuxedo jacket and his signature thick gold chain, she looked out at the sea of wealthy tech investors and socialites. She felt an overwhelming sense of superiority. She had successfully discarded a broke regional sales manager and upgraded to a tech billionaire. She was finally the high society queen she always believed she deserved to be. The ceremony went off without a single hitch. The reception that followed was even more extravagant. A famous pop star had been hired for the first dance, and Lance was walking around the room with a cigar in his mouth, aggressively boasting about the upcoming initial public offering of Apex Digital. He was loud, arrogant, and completely oblivious to the massive storm gathering right outside the heavy oak doors of the ballroom. Around 9 o'clock in the evening, right as the best man was tapping his crystal glass to begin a toast, the heavy double doors of the ballroom were suddenly shoved wide open. The loud pulsing music from the live band was abruptly cut off by the sound of heavy boots marching across the polished hardwood floor. A dozen men and women wearing dark suits and tactical windbreakers with bold yellow letters across the back walked into the reception. It was the Federal Bureau of Investigation, accompanied by agents from the Securities and Exchange Commission. They did not wait for an invitation. and they certainly did not care that they were ruining a multi-million-dollar wedding. They spread out quickly, securing all the exits and instructing the catering staff to step away from the tables. The ballroom fell into a dead, terrified silence. Savannah froze, her champagne flute trembling in her hand. Lance tried to maintain his arrogant tech bro persona. He puffed his chest out and marched toward the lead federal agent, a tall, unsmiling man holding a thick stack of legal warrants. "Excuse me," Lance demanded, his voice echoing in the quiet room. "This is a private event. You cannot just barge in here. Do you have any idea who I am? I will have my lawyers sue this entire department by tomorrow morning." The lead agent did not even blink. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a pair of heavy steel handcuffs. "We know exactly who you are, Lance." The agent said, his voice loud and incredibly clear. "You are under arrest for wire fraud, securities fraud, and the operation of a massive financial Ponzi scheme. Turn around and place your hands behind your back." The color instantly drained from Lance's face. The arrogant swagger completely vanished. He tried to take a step back, stammering something about a misunderstanding, but two other agents immediately grabbed his arms and forced them behind his back. The sharp click of the handcuffs echoing in the silent ballroom was the loudest sound Savannah had ever heard. Savannah snapped out of her shock and ran forward, her heavy crystal gown dragging awkwardly across the floor. She grabbed the agent's sleeve, her perfectly manicured nails digging into his dark jacket. "Stop!" Savannah screamed hysterically. "What are you doing? You are ruining my wedding. He is a billionaire. He owns a tech company." The lead agent looked at Savannah with a mixture of pity and professional detachment. "He does not own anything, ma'am," the agent stated coldly. "Apex Digital is a complete fraud. He has been using money stolen from retail investors to fund this wedding, buy his cars, and purchase that massive diamond on your finger. In fact, we have already frozen all of his accounts. Everything you think you own is currently being seized by the federal government as evidence of criminal activity. That includes the penthouse you live in, the cars you drive, and every single piece of jewelry he has gifted you over the last 6 months." Savannah stood completely paralyzed in the center of the massive ballroom. She watched in absolute horror as the federal agents marched her new husband out the doors in handcuffs. The wealthy guests began frantically grabbing their coats and rushing toward the exits, desperate to distance themselves from the radioactive fallout of the arrest. No one offered her any sympathy. No one stopped to help her. They looked at her with the exact same disgust she had shown Brandon on the sidewalk months ago. The towering orchid walls and the gold leaf cake suddenly looked like pathetic props in a terrible play. Savannah was left standing completely alone in a cold, empty ballroom, wearing a $20,000 gown she no longer owned, realizing that her ultimate upgrade was nothing but a federal crime. The morning after the disastrous wedding, the financial news cycle was completely dominated by the collapse of Apex Digital. Brandon was lying on his lumpy mattress in the damp basement, staring at his cracked phone screen. The headline of a major news blog practically jumped out at him. "Tech CEO arrested by FBI at lavish wedding reception." Below the bold text was a blurry cell phone photograph taken by a fleeing guest. It showed Lance being led out of the grand ballroom in handcuffs, while Savannah stood in the background looking absolutely horrified in her massive crystal gown. A twisted, triumphant smile spread across Brandon's unwashed face. He felt a sudden, intense rush of vindication. Savannah had ruthlessly discarded him, mocked his financial status, and humiliated him on the street, all for a man who turned out to be a massive federal criminal. She had lost everything in the blink of an eye. In his mind, this was absolute poetic justice. She got exactly what she deserved for abandoning him. But as he stared at the picture of Savannah's ruined wedding, his narcissistic brain began to process the information through a completely different, highly delusional lens. He looked around the depressing basement. His car had been towed. He had no job. He had no money. He had hit absolute rock bottom. But Lance was going to prison, and Savannah was effectively erased from the equation. In Brandon's deeply warped reality, this was not just a news story. This was a sign from the universe. He convinced himself that the catastrophic failure of his relationship with Savannah was actually a divine intervention meant to push him back to where he truly belonged. He thought about the article he had read about me just a few weeks ago. The $100 million merger, my promotion, my incredible success. He completely ignored the fact that my success was built after I threw him out. Instead, he decided that my wealth and his current poverty were just temporary obstacles in our grand romantic narrative. He genuinely believed I was sitting in my penthouse, secretly heartbroken, waiting for him to finally realize my true worth. Driven by this sudden burst of manic hope, Brandon sat up on the edge of his mattress and opened his text message thread with me. The last message sent between us was months ago when I told him to have his boxes out of my apartment. He took a deep breath, his thumbs hovering over the cracked keyboard, and began to type out massive emotional paragraphs. "Clara," he typed frantically, "I just saw the news about Savannah and Lance. It made me realize how completely blind I have been. I am so incredibly sorry for everything I put you through. I was manipulated. I was brainwashed by a woman who only cared about money and status. She poisoned my mind against you, but the truth is she could never hold a candle to you. You are the only woman who ever truly loved me for who I am." He hit send, watching the blue bubble appear on the screen. He did not stop there. He immediately started typing a second massive paragraph, pouring his entirely fabricated remorse into the digital void. "I have lost everything, Clara," he continued. "I lost my job, my car, and my apartment. I am living in a terrible basement. But losing all of those material things finally made me see clearly. None of that matters without you. We spent 8 years building a life together. You cannot just throw that away. You are my soulmate. I know I hurt you, but I also know you are the most forgiving, understanding woman in the world. Please just give me one more chance to prove I can be the man you deserve. Let me come home." He hit send again. His heart was pounding against his ribs. He sat alone in the dim light of the basement, his eyes glued to the bottom of the message thread. He watched the screen with agonizing intensity, waiting for any sign of life. 5 minutes passed, then 10 minutes. Finally, a tiny word appeared beneath his desperate paragraphs. "Read." The timestamp confirmed that I had opened the message. Brandon held his breath, waiting for the little typing indicator to appear. He waited for me to send back a long, emotional reply. He waited for me to tell him I missed him too, but the screen remained completely still. 5 more minutes ticked by, and then a full hour. No reply came, just that single cold confirmation that his words had been seen. A normal person would take that silence as a definitive rejection. But Brandon was not normal. His ego simply could not process the concept of absolute indifference. He smiled, wiping a bead of sweat from his forehead. "She read it," he whispered to himself in the quiet room. "She is just overwhelmed. She does not know what to say. She is hesitating because she is scared to get hurt again." He locked his phone and tossed it onto the mattress. His delusion had officially taken full control. He convinced himself that my silence was actually a cry for a grand romantic gesture. I did not want a text message. I wanted him to show up and fight for our love in person, and that was exactly what he decided to do. The next morning, Brandon woke up with a renewed sense of manic purpose. He had spent the entire night staring at the read receipt on his phone, completely twisting my silence into a secret invitation. He was absolutely convinced that a text message was simply not grand enough to win back a woman of my caliber. In his delusional mind, I was sitting in my corner office, staring out at the city skyline, desperately waiting for him to kick the doors down and sweep me off my feet. He believed that my lack of response was just a test of his dedication. But he also knew he could not show up to my corporate headquarters looking like a man who slept on a damp basement floor. He needed to look the part of the high-value executive he still pretended to be. He spent the first 2 hours of the morning aggressively calling old college acquaintances, begging for a small cash loan, and lying that he needed it for an emergency medical copay. After dozens of rejections, he finally managed to scrape together $200 from a guy he had not spoken to in 5 years. Brandon immediately took the city bus to a discount department store. He bypassed the casual clothes and went straight for the clearance rack of formal wear. He bought the cheapest navy blue suit they had available. The fabric was stiff and unbreathable, the shoulders were awkwardly padded, and the pants were slightly too short. But as Brandon looked at his reflection in the fitting room mirror, his narcissism completely blinded him to reality. He did not see a broke, unemployed man in a cheap suit. He saw a handsome, successful conqueror ready to reclaim his prize. When he returned to the moldy basement apartment to change, Patricia was sitting at the small folding table in the corner. She was sorting through a stack of final collection notices and utility shut-off warnings. The brutal foreclosure of her beloved suburban home and the harsh reality of living in a leaky basement had finally shattered her lifelong delusion. She was broken. She watched quietly as her son stood in front of the cracked bathroom mirror, aggressively adjusting his cheap polyester tie and splashing tap water on his face to simulate expensive cologne. "What exactly are you doing, Brandon?" Patricia asked, her voice raspy and completely exhausted. Brandon smiled at his reflection, admiring his own jawline. "I am going to get my life back, Mom. I am going to Clara's office right now. She read my messages last night. She is just playing hard to get, waiting for me to show up and fight for her like a real man. Once I apologize in person, she will take me back and we can get out of this disgusting place." Patricia stood up from the folding chair, her eyes widening in genuine panic. "Are you completely out of your mind?" she yelled, her voice echoing sharply off the damp concrete walls. "Clara does not want you, Brandon. I went to the public library yesterday to use the computer. I saw the news articles about her. She is an executive vice president now. She is closing $100 million mergers. She is so far out of our league that we cannot even see her anymore." Brandon spun around, his face twisting with sudden defensive rage. "Do not talk about her like that," he snapped violently. "You do not know her like I do. She is just putting on a tough front to protect herself because I hurt her. Women like Clara do not care about money or titles. They care about loyalty. I'm going to walk into her office, look her in the eyes, and sweep her off her feet." Patricia shook her head, heavy tears welling in her tired eyes. "You have not changed, Brandon. You are wearing a cheap suit paid for with borrowed money, and your car was literally dragged down the street by a repo man yesterday. If you walk into that building, she is not going to kiss you. She is going to have you arrested for trespassing. You need to wake up and face reality." But Brandon was completely immune to reality. He ignored his mother's tears, grabbed his worn-out leather briefcase, which was entirely empty, and stormed out of the basement. Because he no longer owned a vehicle, he was forced to take the subway into the financial district. He stood awkwardly in the crowded train car, sweating profusely in his unbreathable suit, surrounded by actual businessmen who looked at him with mild annoyance. He spent the entire 40-minute ride rehearsing his grand romantic speech in his head, absolutely certain that his charm would instantly erase all the damage he had done. When he finally stepped off the train and walked up to the street level, he found himself standing directly in front of my new corporate headquarters. The building was an absolute fortress of modern wealth. It was a towering skyscraper made entirely of sleek black glass and steel, dominating an entire city block. Brandon tilted his head back, staring up at the imposing structure. Instead of feeling intimidated by the massive empire I had built without him, his twisted ego processed it as a personal victory. He truly believed all of this was about to belong to him again. He adjusted his poorly fitting jacket, plastered on his signature arrogant salesman smile, and confidently strutted through the revolving glass doors into the high-security lobby, completely oblivious to the absolute destruction waiting for him upstairs. The lobby of the corporate headquarters was a sweeping expanse of white marble and brushed steel. Security guards in tailored suits stood near the glowing digital turnstiles, checking the identification of every executive that walked through the doors. Brandon stood near the entrance, suddenly feeling the crushing weight of his own inadequacy. He immediately realized that he could not just walk up to the front desk and ask to see me. He had no appointment, no corporate badge, and his cheap, poorly fitted navy suit made him stick out dangerously among the billionaire investors and high-level executives bustling through the lobby. But Brandon was desperate, and desperate men take foolish risks. He relied on his old deceptive salesman instincts. He lurked near the lobby coffee kiosk, pretending to be engrossed in his phone. When a large group of distracted analysts carrying thick presentation binders walked toward the security gates, Brandon aggressively merged into their group. He stepped uncomfortably close to a young employee and tailgated him right through the glass turnstiles before the sensors could lock him out. He let out a heavy breath of relief, completely unaware that he had just committed criminal trespassing in a highly monitored commercial facility. He quickly ducked into the nearest glass elevator and pressed the button for the top executive floor. As the elevator shot silently upward, his stomach twisted with a potent mixture of raw nerves and manic excitement. He was hyping himself up, replaying his grand apology over and over in his head. The elevator doors chimed open, revealing a completely different universe. The top floor was dead silent, covered in thick, custom-woven carpets that absorbed the harsh sound of his cheap shoes. Massive pieces of modern art hung on the walls, and every office was enclosed in soundproof floor-to-ceiling glass. Brandon walked down the wide corridor, his heart pounding against his ribs, his eyes frantically scanning the frosted glass plaques next to each door. He passed the offices of managing directors and senior partners, feeling a sudden sickening surge of unearned pride. His twisted ego convinced him that all of this power, all of this staggering wealth, was about to be at his absolute disposal again. He firmly believed I was just keeping his seat warm. Finally, he reached the very end of the hallway. He stood in front of a massive set of double mahogany doors leading into the primary executive boardroom. A digital display mounted on the wall right next to the heavy brass handles read, Executive Vice President Clara Risk Management and Acquisitions. This was it, the grand finale of his triumphant return. Brandon aggressively straightened his cheap polyester tie, took a massive shaky breath, and shoved the heavy wooden doors wide open. He did not bother to scan the room. He did not check to see if a sensitive corporate meeting was in progress. He was entirely consumed by his own delusional cinematic narrative. He took 3 large dramatic strides into the center of the boardroom and immediately dropped to one knee on the plush carpet. He bowed his head, clutched his hands to his chest, and let out a loud, manufactured sob that echoed sharply against the expensive acoustic wall panels. Clara. I was so completely wrong, Brandon cried out, his voice trembling with heavily rehearsed emotion. I was completely blind. I let a toxic, materialistic girl poison my mind against the only good thing I ever had. Savannah meant nothing to me. I have lost my job, my home and my pride, but none of it matters. Losing all of those material things finally made me see clearly. You are the only thing I care about. You are the only wife I want. You are my actual soulmate. I am begging you to forgive me. Let me be the man you deserve. Please let me come home. He kept his head bowed for several long, agonizing seconds, letting the heavy silence build in the room. He expected to hear the sound of my heavy leather chair pushing back. He fully expected me to run across the room, drop to the floor beside him in tears, and pull him into a forgiving, passionate embrace. He truly thought his cinematic apology had flawlessly erased years of financial abuse, infidelity, and cruel insults. Slowly, confidently, Brandon lifted his head and opened his eyes to claim his final prize. I was sitting halfway down the massive mahogany conference table. I was wearing a sharp, tailored black blazer, and my hands were resting calmly on the table. I did not look moved by his performance. I did not look heartbroken. I looked completely bored. But the true paralyzing shock did not come from my cold expression. It came from the horrifying realization that I was not alone in the room. Sitting directly at the head of the table, leaning back comfortably in the chairman's seat, was a man wearing an impeccably tailored charcoal suit. It was Harrison. And resting securely in his large, powerful hands was my unlocked cell phone. The heavy silence in the boardroom was absolute. Brandon remained frozen on his knees, his hands still clutched theatrically to his chest. The grand, romantic speech he had spent 40 minutes rehearsing on a crowded subway train suddenly hung in the air like a foul odor. His eyes darted from my empty chair to the head of the massive mahogany table, desperately trying to process the scene in front of him. He recognized Harrison immediately. It was the same billionaire who had utterly humiliated him at the charity auction months ago. But Brandon could not understand why this man was holding my personal cell phone. Harrison did not flinch. He did not look surprised by the sudden intrusion, nor did he look intimidated by the pathetic man kneeling on the expensive carpet. Instead, Harrison looked down at Brandon with a level of absolute, unadulterated disgust. It was the kind of look a person reserves for a cockroach that has somehow crawled onto a pristine dining table. Harrison slowly leaned forward, breaking his relaxed posture. He lifted his hand and casually tossed my cell phone across the polished mahogany surface. The device slid across the smooth wood with a sharp scraping sound, coming to a dead stop exactly 3 inches from the edge of the table, right in front of Brandon's face. The screen was still brightly illuminated, displaying the massive walls of desperate text messages Brandon had sent the night before. "I have been reading your messages to my wife, Harrison," said smoothly, his deep voice carrying a terrifying, effortless authority. "And honestly, your grammar is appalling." Brandon stopped breathing. The air was violently sucked out of his lungs, his brain completely short-circuited, snagging violently on a single impossible word. Wife. The word echoed in his head, bouncing around his skull like a physical weapon. He stared blindly at Harrison, his jaw trembling as he tried to form a coherent response. He wanted to scream that it was a lie that I was his fiancé, that there was absolutely no way I could have moved on and married a billionaire in a matter of months. But the raw, unyielding confidence radiating from Harrison paralyzed him. Harrison leaned his elbows on the table, steepling his fingers together as he analyzed the broken man kneeling on the floor. "You sent those messages late last night," Harrison continued, his tone clinical and detached. "You wrote that you lost your job, your car, and your pride. You begged her to let you come home. You actually convinced yourself that my wife was sitting around, waiting for a broke, unemployed trespasser, wearing a cheap suit, to come sweep her off her feet." I read every single pathetic word. I did not reply because I found it highly entertaining to let you believe you still had a chance. I wanted to see exactly how far your delusion would carry you. And apparently it carried you right past my security desk. Brandon swallowed hard, his throat dry and burning. He slowly lowered his hands, the theatrical performance completely crumbling. He felt incredibly small. The grand cinematic moment he had envisioned had morphed into a psychological slaughterhouse. "You cannot be married to her," Brandon stammered, his voice cracking weakly. "We were together for 8 years. She loved me, she was just angry." Harrison let out a short, humorless laugh that cut straight to the bone. "She was never angry, Brandon. Anger requires emotional investment. She simply recognized a bad asset and liquidated it. You are nothing but a write-off." Before Brandon could formulate another desperate lie to protect his shattered ego, I finally made my presence known. I stepped out from the shadows near the floor-to-ceiling windows, where I had been quietly standing the entire time. I walked slowly toward the center of the room, my heels clicking sharply against the hardwood perimeter of the boardroom. Brandon turned his head, his wide, bloodshot eyes locking onto me. He expected to see the woman he used to control, the woman who wore plain gray suits and quietly paid his credit card bills while he belittled her, but the woman standing in front of him was entirely unrecognizable. I was wearing a flawless, custom-tailored blazer. My posture was perfectly straight, and my presence commanded the entire room. As I stepped into the bright overhead lights of the boardroom, I reached out to rest my hand on the back of my leather chair. The intense fluorescent lighting caught the flawless rare 5-carat emerald-cut diamond, sitting on my left ring finger. The massive stone flashed with blinding brilliance, a physical, undeniable manifestation of the untouchable empire I had built with Harrison. Brandon stared at the blinding diamond, his face turning a sickening shade of gray. He looked up at my face, desperately searching for a flicker of the love, the anger, or the jealousy he had so heavily relied on for 8 years. He found absolutely nothing. I looked down at him not with anger and not with hatred. I looked at him with total, suffocating indifference. He was a complete stranger kneeling in my office, and his presence meant absolutely nothing to me. Brandon stared at the massive diamond on my finger, his brain desperately scrambling to construct a narrative that protected his fragile ego. He could not accept that he had been completely outplayed. He could not accept that I had genuinely moved on, upgraded my life, and married a billionaire while he was sleeping on a damp concrete floor. His face twisted into an ugly mask of denial and bitter rage. He slowly climbed off his knees, brushing the dust off his cheap polyester suit, trying to reclaim some microscopic fraction of his lost dignity. "You are lying," Brandon stammered, his voice cracking as he pointed a shaking finger directly at Harrison. "This is a complete joke. You do not love him, Clara. You married this guy just to make me jealous. He is nothing but a rebound, a walking ATM you found to fund your revenge fantasy. You brought me up here to show off your fake new life because you are still obsessed with me." I did not even blink. I did not feel the need to defend my marriage to a man who forged tax documents to buy a car. I simply crossed my arms and watched him unravel. Harrison, however, found Brandon's outburst incredibly amusing. He did not yell. He did not stand up and threaten Brandon physically. Men with actual power never need to raise their voices. Harrison calmly reached across the mahogany table and picked up a sleek silver remote control. He pressed a single button. The heavy blackout shades over the floor-to-ceiling windows automatically descended, plunging the room into a cool cinematic dimness. Behind Harrison, a massive digital projector screen smoothly lowered from the ceiling. The projector hummed to life, casting a bright, crisp image across the front of the boardroom. "You think my marriage is a revenge fantasy?" Brandon Harrison asked smoothly, spinning the silver remote in his fingers. "Let me show you what actual power looks like. Let me show you exactly how small your world really is." Harrison clicked the remote, and a highly detailed corporate legal document appeared on the massive screen. The bold heading at the top read, "Official Notice of Corporate Acquisition." "Look closely at the screen," Brandon Harrison instructed, his voice echoing with terrifying authority. "Does that company logo look familiar to you?" Brandon squinted at the bright screen. His stomach violently dropped into his shoes. It was the logo of the regional sales firm where he had worked for the past 5 years. The exact same company that had fired him just weeks ago for losing his biggest client. When you sat in your manager's office and signed your termination papers, your boss told you that your biggest account had been absorbed by a new parent company. Harrison said, his eyes locking onto Brandon like a predator watching its prey. He told you the new executive board flagged your profile as a massive liability. What he did not tell you is that my venture capital firm was the entity that orchestrated the buyout. I did not just absorb your client, Brandon. I bought your entire company. I signed the authorization that stripped you of your corporate badge and threw you out onto the street. Brandon stumbled backward, his shoulder slamming into the heavy wooden doorframe. He could barely breathe. The walls of the boardroom felt like they were physically closing in on him. But Harrison was not finished. He clicked the remote again. A new document appeared on the screen. It was a commercial real estate deed. "You see, a man like you thinks power is buying a fake Rolex or leasing a luxury car," Harrison continued relentlessly. "Real power is infrastructure. Last week, my real estate subsidiary purchased a portfolio of distressed residential properties from a local bank. One of those properties was a heavily mortgaged suburban home that recently went into foreclosure. Harrison clicked the remote one final time, zooming in on the property address. It was Patricia's house. "I own the company that fired you," Harrison revealed, his voice dropping to a low absolute chill. "I own the building your mother's foreclosed house was sold to. I own the debt that is currently crushing your family. You exist in an ecosystem I control. You are a microscopic pest living in my basement, and I could crush you completely without ever leaving this chair." Brandon completely broke down. The sheer, overwhelming scale of Harrison's power finally shattered the last remaining pieces of his delusion. His legs gave out, and he collapsed onto the expensive carpet. He was no longer trying to look arrogant. He was no longer trying to be the charming salesman. He was a cornered, terrified animal. Tears streamed down his face, ruining his cheap suit as he began to openly sob. He crawled forward on his knees, his hands reaching out desperately toward me. "Clara, please." Brandon begged, his voice a pathetic, high-pitched whine. "Please stop this. I have nothing left. My mother is going to be on the street. I am starving. Just give me a job. Let me work in the mailroom. Give me a loan, anything. I will do whatever you want. Just tell him to give my mother her house back. Please, Clara, I am begging you." I looked down at the man I had spent 8 years supporting. The man who had taken my money, insulted my personality, and flaunted his infidelity in front of my face. I felt absolutely no pity. I felt the profound cleansing satisfaction of watching karma execute a flawless judgment. I took a slow step forward, looking down at his tear-stained face. "You do not get to demand grace from the woman you tried to destroy?" I said, my voice completely devoid of emotion. "I kept a roof over your head, and you called me a boring calculator. I paid your debts, and you used my credit cards to buy diamonds for another woman. When you sat at that table in Le Bernardin, you told me I was not worthy of being your wife." I paused, letting the heavy silence amplify my next words. I delivered the ultimate verbal kill shot. "You were absolutely right, Brandon. I was never worthy of you. I was meant for an empire, and you were meant for the basement." I turned away from him, completely dismissing his existence. I reached across the mahogany table and firmly pressed the glowing silver button on the executive intercom system. "Security," I said clearly into the microphone. "We have a trespasser in the executive boardroom. Please send an escort immediately." I released the button. Brandon was sobbing hysterically, burying his face in his hands, fully realizing that his life was completely over. 30 seconds later, the heavy mahogany doors swung open. But it was not just a pair of anonymous security guards who walked into the room. Leading the detail was a tall, powerfully built man wearing an impeccably tailored charcoal suit that rivaled Harrison's. He looked sharp, confident, and entirely in control. Brandon slowly lifted his head, his tear-filled eyes widening in absolute shock. It was Jamal. Jamal was no longer the exhausted veterinarian dealing with a toxic mother-in-law. Following his divorce from Amanda, Harrison had recognized Jamal's brilliant mind and incredible work ethic. Harrison's venture capital firm had just funded a massive national pet care tech startup, and Jamal had been appointed as their chief veterinary consultant, complete with an executive salary and an office just 3 floors down from mine. Jamal stood in the doorway, flanked by 2 massive security officers. He looked down at his former brother-in-law kneeling on the floor in a cheap, sweat-stained suit. Jamal did not look angry. He just smirked, adjusting his expensive silk tie. Jamal stepped fully into the boardroom, his custom charcoal suit fitting his athletic frame perfectly. He looked down at the pathetic, sobbing mess of a man kneeling on the carpet. Brandon's mouth was hanging open in absolute shock. He could not comprehend how Jamal, the man his mother had always treated like a second-class citizen, was now standing here as a high-level executive commanding a corporate security detail. Jamal adjusted his expensive silk tie and offered a cold, satisfied smirk. "Time to go, man." Jamal said, his voice echoing with absolute finality. "You are trespassing on my sister-in-law's property, and we do not tolerate pests in this building." Brandon let out a hysterical, broken wail. He lunged forward, trying to grab the edge of the mahogany table, desperately trying to anchor himself in a world he no longer had access to. But he never even made it close. The two massive security guards stepped forward with practiced efficiency. They grabbed Brandon by the arms effortlessly, hoisting his entire body off the floor. "No." Brandon screamed, his voice cracking, as his cheap dress shoes scrambled uselessly against the plush carpet. "Clara, please do not do this. I am sorry, I love you, let me stay. Let me. I will do anything." I did not answer him. I simply turned my back and walked toward the floor-to-ceiling windows looking out at the sprawling city skyline. I did not want to see his face anymore. The heavy wooden doors of the boardroom swung open, and the guards dragged Brandon out into the hallway. His desperate screams echoed down the quiet executive corridor, but the sound was quickly muffled as the heavy mahogany doors clicked shut behind him. From the safety of the boardroom, the rest of his humiliating exit was left to my imagination, but Jamal later told me exactly how it happened. Brandon was dragged past the glass offices of dozens of high-level executives who stopped what they were doing to watch the spectacle. He was forced into the service elevator, crying and pleading the entire way down. When they reached the ground floor, they dragged him through the pristine white marble lobby. The wealthy investors and corporate directors parted like the Red Sea, staring in absolute disgust at the unhinged man in the cheap polyester suit. The guards pushed him through the revolving glass doors and physically tossed him out onto the busy Manhattan street. He landed hard on the cold concrete pavement right in the middle of the afternoon pedestrian rush. Up in the quiet sanctuary of the penthouse boardroom, the silence was beautiful. Harrison walked up behind me. He did not say a single word. He simply wrapped his strong arms around my waist and pulled me back against his chest. I leaned into his warmth, feeling a profound sense of safety and absolute peace. We stood by the massive glass window and looked down at the street level 50 stories below. The people on the sidewalk looked like tiny ants. But even from that incredible height, I could easily spot a tiny figure wearing a navy blue suit, picking himself up from the concrete. He brushed off his dirty knees, looking wildly around the busy street as pedestrians deliberately stepped around him to avoid his chaotic energy. Then he tilted his head back and looked up at the towering glass fortress. He was completely locked out. He had no money, no home, no family willing to tolerate his lies, and no access to the woman he had spent 8 years trying to destroy. Harrison pressed a soft, lingering kiss against my forehead. "It is over," he whispered quietly. The garbage took itself out. I smiled, resting my hand over his. "Yes, it is. And the air up here is finally clear." When a toxic person tells you that you are not enough, believe them. You are not enough for their small world because you were built for a bigger one. For years, I allowed a man to convince me that my ambition was a flaw, that my financial responsibility made me cold, and that my worth was defined by how much of his brokenness I was willing to fix. I funded his illusion of success while he actively tried to tear down my reality. Upgrading your life is not just about money. It is about boundaries. It is about realizing that you do not owe your light to people who are determined to live in the dark. It is about looking at the heavy, exhausting weight you have been carrying for years and finally deciding to drop it completely. Have you ever had to cut dead weight to reach your full potential? Have you ever walked away from a toxic family member or a parasitic partner who tried to convince you that you were the problem? Drop your story in the comments below. I want to hear how you reclaimed your life. And remember, the best revenge is simply becoming unreachable. The story of Clara serves as a powerful reminder that our self-worth should never be determined by those who actively exploit us. For years, Clara fell victim to the sunk cost fallacy, believing that if she just poured enough time, money, and emotional energy into a broken relationship, her partner would eventually transform into the man he pretended to be. The most profound lesson here is the absolute necessity of establishing ruthless boundaries. We often confuse unconditional love with unconditional tolerance, allowing toxic individuals to drain our resources while blaming us for their own shortcomings. Clara's turning point wasn't born out of screaming anger, but out of cold, calculated clarity. She realized that her ex-fiancé was merely a scavenger who fed off her success to construct his own illusion of grandeur. When toxic people tell you that you aren't enough for them, it is rarely a reflection of your inadequacy. Instead, it is a glaring spotlight on their inability to exist at your level. Many of us harbor a deeply ingrained desire to fix broken people, sacrificing our own peace to shield them from the consequences of their actions. However, true empowerment begins the exact moment you stop funding your own disrespect. Upgrading your life does not necessarily require a massive financial windfall. Rather, it means cultivating an environment where your energy is reciprocated, protected, and honored. It is about having the courage to walk away from an unyielding drain on your soul and recognizing that your peace is too expensive to compromise. Clara's ultimate revenge was simply becoming unreachable to the people who took her for granted. Take a moment today to evaluate the relationships in your life and boldly cut ties with the toxic dead weight that is holding you back from your true potential.